State Senator Joe Pittman is with us this morning, joining us in a remote studio to talk about yesterday's ruling by a federal judge striking down some of Governor Tom Wolf's pandemic restrictions due to unconstitutionality. And Senator, let's get it right off the bat. What's your reaction?
Good morning, Todd. I think it's validation of much of the criticism that occurred at the outset of the pandemic. And as we've talked before, I recognize that the governor and his administration were in a very difficult position to try to figure out how to manage what we were concerned about going into this pandemic. And at the end of the day, that was the unknown. But we also had the fundamental problems with the unilateral nature and the inconsistency in the rules he set forth. And I go back to the fundamental example of how on earth Lowe's and Walmart could remain open throughout the pandemic, yet Luxembourg's and the 700 shop had to close. That type of inconsistency and unfair treatment was throughout his proposals and his initiatives and his efforts. And I have yet to have one person explain to me how it was logical to allow that kind of scenario to unfold. And so what the courts have ruled on in part is water over the dam, but it also affects some of the current mitigation efforts in place. And now with the threat of appeals and continued litigation, there may be many more chapters to be written in this.
Our conversation brought to you by Marcus Mack, a law firm representing injured people. You know, in NFL, when they have replays, the call stands unless there's compelling evidence to change it. The call right now is that they are unconstitutional. And so a court process would have to move forward. He could seek an emergency stay of the federal judge's warning by going to a higher court. But as of now, those restrictions are, I assume, lifted, and that includes the 250 people gathering thing, which must make some high school football parents a little bit relieved.
That is correct. I mean, my understanding is pending any other court action that the crowd size limitations, both indoors and outdoors, as well as the restrictions on capacity, are lifted.
Yeah, and that doesn't mean storm the gates, people. Each entity will make its own rules, and that includes our schools and our establishments. But it must hearten you as somebody who wanted the legislature to be involved in this all along and just wanted to let the people have a say and find out just what the governor's data is that he's relying upon to make these decisions. It just must mean a lot to you that the courts come down on this side.
You're exactly right, Todd. I mean, this whole discussion has been about how we govern. And we govern through law and order. We govern through a constitutional framework that ensures co-equal governance and ensures that the public has a voice in the process and a seat at the table. We have our republic because we objected to the unilateral monarchy rule. And that's what we've had in the Commonwealth over the last 6 months. And that is not an exaggeration. That is not hyperbole. That is fact. What we have had, based on an emergency declaration, is a governor who has run this state on his own. And that's not how we're structured. So I hope he does come to the table and he helps to bring us into the conversation and have a real-world conversation about what we can and can't do functionally to make sure that this pandemic is properly managed, but that we also allow people to move on with their daily lives and, more importantly, continue on with their livelihoods. And most significantly to me is allowing our young people to receive a quality education to move forward in as normal of a process as possible during the school year.
Of all three of those aspects that the federal judge struck down as unconstitutional yesterday, they're all very, very important. The restrictions on businesses, who can be open and who can't, what is life-sustaining and what is not, those were the ones that were particularly galling right from the start. And a part of that is that because of how long this has been in effect, there are businesses that will never come back.
You're right. And, every business is life-sustaining to somebody. And I go back to the very beginning, one of the very first issues I had in the closures, and when we had this definitional framework come out about what is and isn't life-sustaining, and then we had this waiver process, I was dealing with a local contractor who was in the middle of renovating kitchens in people's homes. And he was ordered to cease operation. So here we are with a stay-at-home order. We have people required to stay in their house, and they don't have functional kitchens. And the governor would not allow their contractor to finish the work and make their kitchen functional. I mean, those were the practical inconsistencies with all of this that were simply mind-numbing. And it goes to the fundamental point of the problem that we had, is that he would throw this stuff at the wall, and then he'd go back and hide behind his computer screen. He'd have these virtual press conferences. He would not give us the tools to explain and justify the decision-making process. And he had absolutely no clarity whenever it came to due process and appeals. And that's the fundamental point that the court issued yesterday.
Yeah. One person should not be in the position of picking winners and losers, and that's what has been happening over the last 6 months, is he's picked the ones that he thinks should be the winners in this, and everybody else is on the losing side. All of this being said, this is still a very, very serious health problem. And we see from the numbers here in Indiana that have gone up since the return of students to campus, the disturbing news that we heard over the weekend of escalating numbers at IUP of COVID-positive tests. Something has to be done, but it has to be done within the framework of the legalities of our system.
It does. But, Todd, we also have to keep in perspective that cases do not necessarily equate to hospitalizations, and they don't necessarily equate to death. We are at 82% recovery of all cases identified in the Commonwealth over the last 2 weeks. So 82% so far have recovered. When we look at our hospitalization rates, certainly statewide, and remember, at the beginning, this was about flattening the curve to ensure our hospitals would not be overwhelmed, and that has been accomplished. The data as of yesterday showed that throughout the entire Commonwealth, we are down to 60 individuals on a ventilator. We are down to 400 people hospitalized with illness associated to COVID. At the peak in April, we had 10 times the number of people on a ventilator, and we had 7 times the number of people hospitalized. We have flattened the curve, and we have recognized the vulnerable population. And in reality, the young, where the highest growing caseload is not the vulnerable population. They are recovering. I believe a third of the students at IUP have already recovered. The key is to make sure that they do not spread it to vulnerable populations. And that's where the efforts to mitigate this within our nursing homes, to recognize that people who have underlying conditions need to be extremely careful, and the rest of us need to be very careful around those with comorbidities and underlying health conditions. And that's why hand washing, common sense social distancing, wearing a mask, certainly in confined areas, is all part of that making sense. But we have to keep the case numbers and the hospitalization numbers and the severity of it in perspective.
Yeah, we really do. And that sort of vigilance is also helped by the treatment protocols that have changed from the very beginning, when so little was known about how to treat this, and to now. Probably patients that would have presented with the symptoms they present now would have been treated much differently 6 months ago than they are being treated now, because we've learned so much more about this thing.
And the testing is different. When we began this, we were getting a 20% positivity rate. We're now getting 4 to 6 to 7% positivity rate of the tests. And part of that is because we have expanded our testing. And early on in this, there were people who were most likely COVID positive, but we didn't have the testing capacity to recognize them. But they were cases that were less severe. They were individuals that were sent home to convalesce, to isolate, and to get better in most cases. So we have a combination of factors occurring here that, in my opinion, and your point about being able to treat it and understand what we're dealing with, are fundamental to allowing us to move forward to being vigilant and watchful, but to no longer continue to provide this virus fear. This virus deserves our respect. It doesn't deserve our fear.
Senator Joe Pittman is with us this morning, a federal judge ruling against several of the measures for COVID-19 imposed by Governor Wolf. A part of all of this relates as well to the RGGI regulations, the one-sided nature of the governor deciding to go off on his own and exclude anybody else from his decision-making process. RGGI, of course, has been much in the news in the last couple of weeks. Governor's veto threat is always out there. Now a chance to override that veto. And, well, let's talk about whether or not that happens and where we move forward in this RGGI debate from here.
Well, today, I believe, is the day that the Environmental Quality Board, which is the bureaucracy within the DEP that promotes rules and regulations, is to vote to proceed to begin consideration of this carbon tax. So we'll see what that board does. My guess is that it will pass. But then we do have the legislation on the governor's desk. We'll see what he chooses to do. But I pray that at some point he's going to recognize, just as with his unilateral decision-making process in this virus, that he can't continue to ignore the impact of his decisions. And we've heard that supposedly our region is an affected community and that they're going to focus on our community and ensure that we recover from the devastation that his carbon tax will inflict on us. But yet we hear nothing, we see nothing. It's all platitudes, it's all happy talk. There's no action. There's been absolutely no accountability from him for his actions and the consequences they're going to take. But we've had great friends and support within the trade unions. The labor sector fully recognizes what the governor's attempting to do and how it's going to destroy so many livelihoods. And I'm hopeful that he will at some point come around to understanding that impact. But his very discussion is already causing disinvestment in our communities. We're seeing thousands of workers going to Ohio and West Virginia to do renovations and repairs on coal-fired power plants in Ohio and West Virginia. They're licking their lips for our power plants to close here in Pennsylvania so they can take advantage of it. And to me, that is fundamentally wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to have to, really going to have to hammer out something in this state constitution to ensure this never happens again. Senator, thank you so much for coming in to visit with us today. This isn't going away anytime soon. There's still a lot of battling to do.
You're right about that, Todd. Many chapters to be written in this book, but I'm eager to continue to be part of the process and fighting for the interests of our communities.
Appreciate it. Have a great day today.
You too, sir.
Day.
You too, sir.
Day.